Right, Genesis 39, beginning at 21, and then going on to chapter 40, ending up in verse 8. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favour in the sight of the keepers of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And it came to pass, after these things, that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued the season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Joseph's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sad today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there's no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Amen.
We're continuing looking at this wonderful story, obviously a true story. It's a biography, really. So many chapters that we read about Joseph here in Genesis. It's obvious that he has a special place in the heart of God, in the plan of God, and in the Word of God. And we've seen how he started off as a favoured son. We saw the jealousy and the hatred that his brothers had for him, and how they plotted to be done with him completely. And then God intervened, and instead of slaying him, which was the original intent, he was sold into slavery. He was sold to some merchants that were travelling down to Egypt. And we looked last week where he ended up. He ended up in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar was the head of police, if you like. He was the head of, he was called the chief of the guard, I believe is the title given to him. Yeah, captain of the guard. And he was in charge of looking after Pharaoh's household and protecting. And that is a household where Joseph ended up. And we saw that Joseph applied himself just as much in Potiphar's household as he did in his father's household. And just as his father had given him extra responsibility, so Potiphar gives him extra responsibility. We read in chapter 39 last week that Potiphar didn't look at anything that he owned. In the end, he handed everything over to the care of Joseph. All he cared about was the meals that he had in front of him every day. He had no thought of anything because he knew he could trust Joseph with everything, and he could. But there was one thing that didn't belong to Joseph, and that was Potiphar's wife. And unfortunately, Potiphar's wife had eyes for Joseph, and she tried to get him to have an affair with her, and he would have nothing at all to do with it. And we found out last week that in his spite, and because of her rejection, she plotted to get him thrown into prison on made-up charges. And that's where we pick up the story now, this evening. Joseph has gone from being the favoured son to being the favoured slave to now finding himself in prison. And at no time has he done anything to justify this treatment at all. Verse 21 gives us a phrase that we came across already a few times. We come across this phrase, but the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord is with him. I wonder if Joseph saw it that way. I wonder if when Joseph was cast into prison, I wonder if he saw it that God was with him. That this was what God had planned for his life. You see, we don't always see it at the time. We know that Joseph could see it with hindsight, but we look at a verse later which shows us he was struggling with the situation that he found himself in. Don't think that he is a superhuman who is just cruising through all the troubles of life. The injustice of it all would have crushed him as much as it would have crushed us. But God didn't forsake him, and God did not turn his back on him. And God was with him. Doesn't it make a big difference when we face the challenges of life to know that God is with us? That we're not on our own. I've said it before, that the Christian is not promised a life without what is okay. But what the Christian is promised is that our guide will walk by our side. He'll be there with us. And in spite of all the scheming that came Joseph's way, in spite of all the difficulties that came his way, he knew that God was always with him. And that relationship held him strong. And that relationship never faltered. He never blamed God for the actions of other men. He never blamed God for what people were doing to him. He kept his relationship with God strong. And God was with him. It says then that God showed him mercy. God showed him mercy. What mercy has been shown him if he's been plucked out from his family, he's been sold as a slave, and now he's being cast into prison? What mercy is being shown him? Well, he goes on to explain what happens in the prison. The Lord is with him, and he, that is Joseph, finds favour, because God gave him favour in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now, a lot of the commentaries have pointed out that the prison was actually attached to Potiphar's house. The part of Potiphar's job was to actually keep an eye on the royal prisoners, and the prison would have actually been attached to his own house. And some of the commentators have made the point that the keeper of the prison would have been familiar with Joseph. We know he spent 13 years in Potiphar's household and in the prison. We don't know the exact split, but most people think it was about 10 years and 3 years. So this man had seen Joseph working in Potiphar's household, and his testimony carried weight. He knew that Joseph was a good man. The whole point of a holding prison at this time was that if a charge or an accusation was brought against you, you would be placed in the prison while the charge was investigated. If you were found innocent, you would then be released. If you were found guilty, judgment would come upon you. What does it tell us about Joseph that he is in prison for at least 3 years? What does it tell us about his case? Well, we know he was innocent. Personally, and you may disagree, and that's fine, personally I think Potiphar knew he was innocent too. He threw him into the prison in anger at the original accusation being made. But I'm sure on reflection, the character of Joseph would have shone through. I know something Martin always says, look at people's track record. Look at people who have treated you in the past. If something happens that causes you to question somebody's loyalty, think about the past. And if they've been a loyal friend to you, why are they suddenly not going to be a friend? And very often it's misunderstandings, isn't it? Very often things have come our way. Sometimes there might be a failure on one of our parts. But does that take away all the past loyalty? Of course it doesn't. How many good friendships have been thrown away on a moment of weakness? Allow each other to be human. Allow each other to be the imperfect person that you are. Because none of us are perfect. And yet so often we can demand perfection. But I'm sure as Potiphar reflected back, he probably came to the same conclusion as everybody else, that Joseph was innocent. If anybody knew Potiphar's wife, surely it was Potiphar. Surely he knew her just as well as he knew Joseph. And could it be that he's still in prison 3 years later? Because although he's innocent, to publicly say that Potiphar's wife had lied would have been a step too far. I don't know. But underlying and beneath it all is the fact that he was still in prison because the time for his release, according to God's timetable, had not yet come about. A lot of people, including Joseph, would have been surprised at how long the sentence was going. But God's timing is absolutely perfect. And as the story unfolds, you will see how God's timing is worked out to perfection. Isn't it interesting that we find he found favour in his household, he found favour with his dad, he found favour in Potiphar's household, he now finds favour in the prison. You see, wherever you drop Joseph, you get the same reaction. Wherever you drop Joseph, you get the same behaviours. It doesn't depend upon his circumstance, it doesn't depend upon his surroundings. His character does not change. It remains the same regardless of where you drop him. Whether he's the favoured son, whether he's the favoured slave, whether he's the favoured prisoner. He's always working for other people's good. At home he was working for his father. In Potiphar's household he was working for Potiphar. In the prison he's working for the prisoners. It tells us in verse 21 that the Lord was with him, he had showed him mercy and he gave him favour. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners. Notice that. It's not all the stuff, it's the prisoners themselves. It's people. They are the ones who Joseph is caring for. Whatever goes on there, it has his doing, his stamp upon it. It would have been the fairest prison you've ever come across. As the favoured prisoner, he would have had a role in dishing out the food, probably. And they were probably used to being given the scraps and the best bits being taken out. But if Joseph's doling it out, they all would have had a fair share. You see, it doesn't matter how much you have. We can still be a good witness and testimony to God in the little that we deal with. And his responsibilities have shrunk down to just a few people inside this prison. But Joseph sees that he can do good. Joseph sees that he can help to ease the situation that they're in, not to make it any worse than it already is. He has compassion for others, and we see that unfolding as the story opens up for us as well. Just as Potiphar took no thought about what was going on within his household, he totally trusted Joseph with everything. We read in verse 23 that the keeper of the prison didn't look into anything that was under Joseph's authority. He wasn't checking on him at all. He had explicit trust that Joseph would do what should be done. Because the Lord was with him. You see, because God is with him, because this character that he has is a God-given character, because he bears the testimony of being a believer and a follower of God, it comes out in his actions. It comes out in his heart, and it comes out in what he does. As chapter 40 opens up to us then, we read about some of the other prisoners who happen to be there. And because it's the prison that's attached to Potiphar's household, the royal prisoners are the ones who come through its doors. And we hear that there were two very important people, the head butler and the head baker. And the head butler would have been more than just somebody who brought the drink for Pharaoh. He would have had responsibility for all the vineyards. He would have had responsibility for the whole process from start to finish. He would have had hundreds of people under his authority. And so too the baker. The chief baker would have had responsibility for all the foods that were being prepared for the royal household. But something has happened. We're not told what it is, but something has happened and they have caused offence to Pharaoh. And he is so angry with them that they too have been cast into prison. I want you to notice something in verse 3 that's not immediately apparent when we first look at it. I want you to look in verse 3 as to who put them under Joseph's authority. Because it's not the keeper of the prison, which is what you'd expect. It tells us in verse 3, so he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them. Who's that? Potiphar. Potiphar. Now, if Potiphar thought that Joseph was guilty and was untrustworthy, why would he be given these royal prisoners into his charge? He knows that Joseph can be trusted, which is why I think he'd come to the conclusion that Joseph was probably innocent. He is the one who places these people under the charge of Joseph. Potiphar entrusts them to him. There was also another thought that went through my head. While Joseph was in Potiphar's household was prosperous. I wonder if that's why Potiphar kept hold of it. I don't know. So they have been confined in the prison. And something miraculous happens. Something with the intervention of God happens. Because it tells us in verse 5 that on the same night, not on different nights now, but on the same night, both of them had been spoken to in a dream. And each of them had woken up troubled by the dream. In verse 6 we read that Joseph comes into them in the morning. You see, Joseph is caring for them. Joseph is responsible for bringing their daily needs. And when he comes in, he notices that they're sad or despondent. He cares about them. Surely you're used to seeing people sad in prison. But you see, Joseph understood there was something different here. There was something heavier here. He sees how much they are struggling. And he has a choice then. He can either think, well, it's nothing to do with me. I'll keep stum. Or he can choose to try and help. And what do we know about Joseph? Well, we know he's going to try and help. That's his character. That's his personality. And he inquires about their sadness. Why is it that you are so sad today? And so they tell him, well, both of us have had dreams, and we don't know what they mean. Now, Joseph doesn't claim any glory for himself here, because he follows that rule that God always gets the glory. God has the glory for the giftings that he gives. We can never boast about gifts that God has given to us. And so he turns around and says, interpretations belong to God. You see, he doesn't say, I have the gift of interpretation, although God had given him that gift. He says, I know there is a God who can interpret dreams. You see, he wants to point to God. He wants them to understand that it is God who wants to speak to them. It is God who's got something to say to them. So what is it that God has said? And what is it that God wanted them to know? And Martin's going to tell us. Verse 9 to the end. Do you want to come out and read, Mark? Just some people with the...
You put that in, can't you? You read that, then. Sorry for the walk. butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." And so Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." And it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. He lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him.
It's a bit gruesome, isn't it? Whenever I read that, it always makes you cringe a bit, really. But let's look at that as well. So they both had their dreams. How nice it would have been to tell the butler what his dream meant. How wonderful it must have been to be able to look him in the eye and say, within 3 days you can see the back of this place. And Joseph had probably been there at least a year already. How much he would have longed for somebody to look him in the eye and tell him that he was going to leave this place. But that wasn't for him at this time. He is able to share that with the butler. Your dream is a good dream. The outcome is a good outcome. Within 3 days you will be restored to the position that you have. Within 3 days you will be back as the chief butler, and everything will be well for you. Before he goes on to give the dream for the baker, remind yourself of what he says to the butler. He knows now that the butler is going to be in a very favoured position. We know from the book of Nehemiah how important the role of the cupbearer and the chief butler is. Somebody that needs to be trusted. It would have been the first time that somebody had been poisoned to replace somebody. It was a very important job. He would have had access to Pharaoh. And Joseph does something here that a lot of us have been guilty of in the past. He sees an opportunity for God to intervene. He sees that. And can you blame him for having his hopes raised? That maybe this is why the butler's come into the prison. Maybe this is why he's had the dream. Because God is working a way to get me out. And who better than Pharaoh? Nobody can stand against him. If he gets me out, I'll be free. Can we blame Joseph for thinking that? Look at the pleading in the words that he has to this chief butler. Remember me. Is that too hard to ask? Considering what he has shown in compassion to this man already? Is it too much to ask that In return, he would also be remembered. Will you just remember me? When everything is restored for you, will you have a thought for me? What about us, the persecuted Christians who are in prison across the world? Do we remember them? Joseph makes that plea, will you remember me? When it is well with you, when your world is back and rosy, will you have a thought for me? And will you show some kindness? I've shown you kindness whilst you've been here, with no hope of return. But you now have an opportunity to return the kindness that I've shown to you. Will you show a kindness to me? Will you just make mention of me to Pharaoh? Will you just bring my case to his ears? And will you get me out of this house? That's his plea. I want to be done with this. I want to be out of this prison. And in verse 15, he explains how he's got there. But look carefully at what is missing in verse 15. You tell me who he blames. For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. What is missing? Bitterness, anger, revenge. It's missing. There is no mention of his brothers. No mention of Potiphar's wife. No mention of the people who have schemed to get him where he is. There is something lovely here, that his spirit has not grown bitter. He just wants it over with. He doesn't care for revenge. And again, we see that later in the story of Joseph. He's not interested in revenge. He just wants this over with. And he believes there's a window of opportunity here for him. And he pleads with the butler that he would put a good word in for him with Pharaoh. The chief baker has been silently sat listening to all of this. And the Bible tells us that when he saw the interpretation was a good one, he had the courage to share his dream. How sad the outcome is for him. Joseph has to give him the honest interpretation of what his dream means. And unlike the butler who is going to be restored in 3 days, the baker is going to be executed. His life is going to come to an end. He also is going to be free of this prison. But it's not the outcome that the butler's having. We might look at that and think, well, that was a bit cruel. Don't forget that Joseph is just interpreting the dream. He's not responsible for it. He's just giving the interpretation to it. Who's given the dream? God's given the dream. God has spoken to the butler, and God has spoken to the baker. He wants them both to know. He wants the butler to know that in 3 days he is going to be restored. The butler has a part to play in the plan of God that is unknown to both him and Joseph at this time. So what does he want the baker to know? The baker has 3 days to put his life right with God. Do you believe that Joseph would have shared this with him and then not spoken to him again? They're there, captive audience. I'm sure that Joseph would not have just left that with him cold. But he would have come back to it and spoken to him about it. Why is God warning him about his death? To give him time to put his life right. It is Pharaoh who is the one who's going to take his life. But God has chosen to allow him to see what is coming his way. And to give him an opportunity to do something about it. Cannot change the fact that Pharaoh is going to take his life. But he can make sure that he's ready to meet his maker. He has that opportunity. 3 days later, everything comes to pass, exactly as God had told them, and exactly as Joseph had interpreted the dreams for them. But it was God's dreams, and it was God's voice. And then in verse 23, such a sad, sad verse, isn't it? Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Almost seems incredible to read, isn't it? How quickly he just put it to one side. It doesn't say that he chose not to say anything about him. It just says he didn't register with him. He didn't care enough. He just forgot him. And Joseph had 2 years of wondering if the butler was going to say anything. No doubt for the first few days and weeks he hoped every time somebody came to the prison they might be coming to get him out. And then as the weeks and months dragged into years, he probably gave up all hope again. What's in this story for us? More than to see how God has an incredible way of working in people's lives, and how even in the midst of the most incredible trials, God is still faithful and God is still with us. There's so much we see in the attitude and actions of men, and we can hold them up against God and see how God is so completely different. Joseph made a plea that he would be remembered, but the butler forgot him. God has promised we will never forget us. We're never out of his thoughts. Never. We're always in his thoughts. God warns us that our life does come to an end. All of us. Our days on earth are numbered. But what then? What then? Do we find ourselves within the household of the King? Or do we find ourselves perishing and lost? We see that picture here as well, don't we? As a Christian, we know that when our days on earth come to an end, we will be received into the royal court. We will be received into the family and the household of God. We know that is our promise. God is a faithful God. It doesn't mean that our path is an easy path. Joseph's path is a path that none of us would ever choose to walk on. And yet, Joseph's own testimony, when he looked back over this time, his own testimony is that God was in it. God was in it. Don't be too hard on yourself if you made that prayer that says, Lord, will you deliver me out of this? That was Joseph's heart. He didn't want to be in prison. He wasn't enjoying it. We looked at Psalm 105 last week, didn't we? About him being in chains and about those irons hurting him. It's not a nice place to be in prison. He's not just cruising through it. It is hurting him. He is pleading to get out. At the time, he wants to be done with it. Yes, with hindsight, you can see the hand of God. But at the time, he wanted to be done with it. Don't be hard on yourself. If you make that prayer that says, God, I want to be done with this, he understands our frame. But Joseph had to wait. Because God had a plan not just for Joseph. God had a plan for Joseph's family too. And God didn't just have a plan for Joseph's family. He had a plan for the whole of Egypt. And Joseph had to wait for all of that to come to fruition as well. God is not a spiteful God. He doesn't cause us to go through difficult days just to make life hard for us. There is always a plan and a purpose to what God is doing in our life. Whether we see it or whether we don't. He is a loving Father, and he leads us and guides us with purpose and with a plan. And when we get to heaven, our testimony will be Joseph's testimony. God was in it. His hand was upon our life. And we thank him that he can be trusted to be our guide. And that's the choice we have tonight. All of us have that choice. As we look to our mortality, are we ready to meet with God? Do we want to spend an eternity with him? Or do we want to perish? Do we want to walk through life, picking our own path, making our own choices? Or do we want to walk the path that he has prepared for us, listening to his leading and following his guiding? Yes, it might be harder, but it's so much better. So much better. Not just for us, but for others as well. And may God use us to be a blessing to others, not just for ourselves. In Jesus' name.